The world of antique picking nationwide has passed away.
American picker star Frank Fritz has died at the age of 60 after suffering a devastating stroke 2 years ago.
At its peak, American Pickers pulled in over 5 million viewers a week, built entirely on the real friendship between Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz. Today, that friendship exists only in memory. Frank battled addiction, vanished from the show, and suffered a stroke that nearly ended his life. He and Mike reconciled quietly before Frank passed away in 2024. Then, in a cruel twist, Mike nearly died himself in a devastating car crash a year later. Now the show's own cast can't agree on whether it's even still alive. So what really happened to American Pickers? The friendship, the fallout, the loss. Let's discuss it all in this video.
His Frank Mike Wolfe. Frank brought the art of picking to millions of viewers.
The golden era, 2010 to 2019. Let's rewind to the beginning, because you can't understand how far something fell without understanding how high it actually climbed. Reality television in 2009 was saturated with manufactured drama. Competition shows, staged conflicts, people who'd clearly been cast for their willingness to yell at each other. Networks were hungry for something that felt different, something that didn't need a soundstage or a script to hold an audience's attention. Mike Wolfe pitched something almost embarrassingly simple. 2 guys, a van, and the entire American backroad system. That was the show. No elimination rounds, no manufactured rivalries, just 2 men driving from small town to small town, knocking on doors, and asking strangers if they had anything old they'd be willing to sell. Mike wasn't a producer playing a character for the cameras. He'd spent decades as an actual picker.
American Picker stars Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz went public. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz traveling around the US looking for treasure, finding that treasure.
Someone who scours flea markets, barns, and estate sales for valuable items to resell. Long before History Channel ever showed interest, that authenticity translated directly onto the screen. Audiences could tell the difference between someone performing enthusiasm and someone who genuinely loved what he was doing. And the show gave viewers something they genuinely couldn't get anywhere else: access. Forgotten barns stuffed floor to ceiling with rusted-out motorcycles. Crumbling sheds hiding vintage gas station signs worth thousands of dollars. Attics packed with mid-century Americana that most people didn't even know still existed. Every episode played out like a small treasure hunt, and the audience rode along in that van right beside Mike and Frank, feeling every pothole with them. Then there was Frank Fritz. If Mike was the show's engine, Frank was its heart. Where Mike came across as polished and business-minded, Frank had a gruff, unpredictable charm.
Frank Fritz finds evidently operates without a business license. Frank Fritz finds when he needed to drop off items.
The guy who always had an opinion, always found the weirdest item in the pile, and never seemed to care whether the cameras were rolling. Fans often compared him to a favorite uncle, the one who tells the same story 3 different ways, and somehow makes it funnier every time. The 2 of them had actually known each other since childhood, and that history showed up on screen as a kind of easy, lived-in rapport you genuinely cannot script. Rounding out the trio was Danielle Colby, who ran things from antique archaeology, the shop Mike had opened years before the show existed. Danielle brought a different kind of energy, sharp, resourceful, and unapologetically herself, and gave the show a home base, a person viewers could check in with between road trips.
Frank was no longer part of the show. In the post, Danielle made it clear that Frank's absence from American Pickers wasn't because of a falling out with Mike.
Together, Mike, Frank, and Danielle formed a kind of triangle that, when it was working, made the whole thing feel less like a TV show and more like eavesdropping on real friends doing something they loved. And people didn't just watch, they engaged. Fans drove out of their way to visit antique archaeology in person. They debated on forums about which finds were staged and which were real. They rewatched old episodes the way some people rewatch sitcoms, not for new information, but for the comfort of familiar people doing familiar things. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Have you ever had a show like that? Not just something you watched, but something you actually looked forward to all week. The kind of thing that felt like catching up with people you knew. If you have, you already understand what American Pickers meant to millions of its most loyal viewers for the better part of a decade. That's important to hold on to, because it's exactly what makes the next part of this story so hard to watch unfold. Great partnerships rarely collapse all at once. They erode, slowly, quietly, in ways that are barely visible until one day you look up and realize how much has already changed.
Friend told the Quad City Times that Wolfe cited Fritz's uniquely funny personality as crucial to making the Pickers formula so successful.
Cracks in the friendship. By the show's later seasons, longtime viewers started noticing something was off. The chemistry that had once felt effortless started to feel a little more distant. The easy back and forth that used to fill up a barn walkthrough started feeling more clipped, more edited around, like something was being smoothed over rather than shown. Frank's screen time began shrinking, and then, without any real announcement, he simply wasn't there anymore. Frank Fritz's last regular season on American Pickers was 2020. There was no dramatic farewell episode, no on-camera goodbye, just an absence that fans picked up on and immediately started asking questions about. In July 2021, Mike Wolfe addressed it publicly for the first time, posting on Instagram that he'd known Frank for as long as I can remember, calling him like a brother, and confirming that Frank would not be returning to the show. It was a warm-sounding statement on its face. Frank, notably, did not receive it that way. He told Newsweek at the time that he thought the post had been written by someone else on Mike's behalf.
In the History Channel's hit show American Pickers, Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe, according to The Sun, after an episode that aired in March 2020, Fritz abruptly and without explanation stopped appearing on the show,
adding that he didn't believe Mike had said 5 kind things about him in the past decade. That public back and forth was the first real sign that whatever was happening between them went beyond a simple scheduling issue. The full explanation came a few weeks later, when Mike gave an interview to the U.S. Sun and said the quiet part out loud. Frank was, in Mike's words, going through a lot personally with his addictions. He said it was unfortunate that decisions Frank had made had shaped who he'd become, and that he'd love to reconnect with him, but that Frank just can't get it right. It's worth pausing here, because this is the part of the story that's easy to sensationalize and important not to. Addiction isn't a plot twist. It's a real, serious health condition that affects a person's relationships, their career, and everyone who loves them. What we know, because Mike said it publicly and on the record, is that he believed Frank's struggles with substance use were at the center of why their partnership fell apart. What we don't know, and what nobody involved has ever laid out in detail, is the full private history between 2 men who'd been friends since childhood. That's theirs, not ours. What we can say clearly is this: a partnership that had once looked like an easy, natural friendship.
the 2 men working on the show together. He explained, while many fans hoped for the partnership to return to their TV screens, the History Channel announced that there are no plans for a reunion.
Had become something far more strained, and both men were, in their own ways, hurting publicly over it. Fans, understandably, took sides. Many rallied hard behind Frank, arguing that whatever was happening behind the scenes, the show owed him more respect than a quiet Instagram statement, and that 15 years of loyalty deserved a real conversation instead of a carefully worded post. Others pointed out that addiction recovery is complicated, and that Mike's silence, while frustrating to watch from the outside, might have reflected real uncertainty about how to handle a friend's health crisis in the middle of a television show with real financial stakes attached to it. Social media comment sections turned into small battlegrounds, with viewers picking apart every word of every statement either man made, looking for proof of who was really at fault. There isn't a clean, satisfying answer to who was right. That's kind of the point. Long friendships under public and financial pressure don't usually break because of one villain. They break because real, difficult things, like health, money, ego, and exhaustion, pile up faster than two people can work through them. And in this case, there was more piling up than viewers even realized yet, because the health situation Mike had referenced in that interview was about to become a lot more serious. A friendship restored too late. In the summer of 2022, Frank Fritz suffered a stroke. It was serious enough that he largely disappeared from public view afterward, and for a while, updates on his condition were scarce. What we do know is that the stroke marked a real turning point, not just medically, but in his relationship with Mike. According to a family friend who spoke with the Quad City Times, Mike and Frank reconciled in May 2023, while Frank was in the middle of his recovery. There's something worth sitting with in that timeline. It wasn't a press statement or a scripted TV reunion that brought them back together. It was one friend showing up for another during one of the hardest stretches of his life. Whatever had gone wrong between them over the previous few years, it clearly wasn't stronger than 4 decades of history. Think about what that actually required from both of them. Frank had spent the better part of 2 years publicly airing how betrayed he felt. Mike had spent that same stretch publicly explaining, in ways that clearly weren't easy to say out loud, why he'd kept his distance. For either of them to walk back into a hospital room after all of that took a kind of humility that doesn't usually make it onto reality television, because it isn't dramatic in the way networks want. It's just quiet. 2 grown men deciding that whatever pride or hurt still sat between them mattered less than showing up. On September 30th, 2024, Frank Fritz died at a hospice facility in Davenport, Iowa. He was 60 years old. According to his death certificate, the cause was complications from the earlier stroke.
Frank Fritz from the History Channel's reality series American Pickers has died in 2022. Frank Fritz was 60 years old.
With aortic stenosis, a heart valve condition, and COPD, a chronic lung disease, listed as contributing factors. Mike Wolfe was by his side when he passed. Mike shared the news himself, writing on Instagram that he'd known Frank for more than half his life, and that what viewers had seen on TV had always been what he'd seen too. A dreamer who was just as sensitive as he was funny, someone who reached people's hearts simply by being himself. He said he felt blessed to have been there with Frank at the end. Danielle Colby posted her own tribute, remembering Frank's humor, his love of tattoos and cats, and small, quiet moments of vulnerability she'd seen from him over the years. The History Channel and the show's production company released a joint statement calling him the bearded charmer, whose search for vintage motorcycles and bikes would be remembered by the show's audience for years to come. Here's what makes this part of the story genuinely complicated, rather than simply sad. Everything that came before it was real too. The addiction struggles were real. The years of public tension were real. Frank's own frustration at feeling sidelined was real. None of that gets erased by a reconciliation or a heartfelt tribute after the fact. But none of it cancels out the reconciliation either. People are allowed to hurt each other and still love each other. Both of those things were true here, and you can hear it in the way Mike chose to talk about his friend once he was gone. For a show that had always sold itself on authenticity, this was the most authentic and most painful chapter it ever produced, and it happened almost entirely off camera. Fans, many of whom had spent years frustrated with how the falling out had been handled, largely responded with grace. The anger from a few years earlier gave way to a shared sense of loss. Whatever had gone wrong between Mike and Frank, most viewers seemed to agree. This was still two old friends who'd built something real together, and one of them was gone far too soon. Nobody could have known, at that point, just how close the show's other founder would come to the same fate barely a year later. The crash that changed everything. September 12, 2025. Columbia, Tennessee. Mike Wolfe and his girlfriend, Letitia Klein.
It's good you're here because we get to spread the staff out. Davey's in the pits, and now we're going to bring on Miss Motocross, Letitia Klein. She's over at the Parts Unlimited tent where they have a special vintage bike show.
We're out driving a vintage 1958 Porsche 356. The kind of car with no airbags, no crumple zones, none of the safety engineering that's standard in anything built in the last few decades. According to Klein's own account, posted to social media afterward, an SUV pulled out from a side street and into their path, leaving them little to no time to react. Mike swerved, but the SUV struck the passenger side of the Porsche. The driver, 76-year-old Lerone Heads, was later charged with DUI, vehicular assault, and failure to yield, resulting in serious bodily injury. The impact was severe. Mike's steering wheel actually broke under the force of the collision, and according to Klein, that was likely the only reason he wasn't impaled by the steering column. He suffered facial injuries, along with knee and wrist trauma, and was released from the hospital within a day. Klein was not so fortunate. She was airlifted to Vanderbilt University Medical Center with a broken jaw in 3 places, broken ribs, a broken sternum, a collapsed lung, and swelling along her spine. She remained hospitalized for days and underwent multiple follow-up procedures in the months that followed, describing her recovery, including temporary limits on her ability to speak clearly, as one of the hardest experiences of her life. Danielle Colby, still connected to both of them, posted her support on Instagram.
After years of speculation, Danielle Colby has finally broken her silence on Frank Fritz, her former co-star from American Pickers,
telling Klein she'd get her voice back and that she loved them both. In the months after the crash, Mike spoke about it with visible weight. He described going to see the wrecked car afterward and finding it more emotional than he expected. The kind of moment, he said, that forces you to recalibrate what actually matters once you understand how close you came to losing it all. Klein, for her part, has been candid about how physically and emotionally draining the recovery has been, describing weeks where her voice, something she relies on both professionally and personally, was severely limited, and calling every day since the crash a gift she doesn't take lightly. By December 2025, months after the crash, Klein was still working through the legal side of the ordeal, preparing to give a victim statement in court as the case against the other driver moved forward. It's easy to read a headline about a car accident and move on within seconds. It's harder to sit with what that timeline actually means. An entire fall and winter spent in physical therapy, court appearances, and slow, painful recovery, while the public conversation had already moved on to the next news cycle. It's hard not to notice the timing here. Less than a year after burying one of his closest friends, Mike Wolfe nearly died in a car crash of his own. You don't need a screenwriter to manufacture drama out of that.
Frank passed away on September 30th, 2 years after suffering a stroke that he unfortunately was unable to recover from, and he passed with Mike and other loved ones by his side in hospice.
Real life did it on its own. What's interesting is what came before the crash, not just after it. In April 2025, months prior to the accident, Mike had already made the decision to permanently close his antique archaeology store in Nashville, a location that had operated for nearly 15 years and become one of the most visited antique destinations in the country. He said at the time that he wanted a different rhythm, one that kept him closer to his hometown in Iowa, his mother, and his daughter. Taken together, the store closure and the crash tell a fairly clear story about where Mike's priorities were already shifting. even before a drunk driver forced the point home in the most literal way possible. Whether that shift means less time on the road for future seasons of American Pickers, or simply a different relationship to the work, is something only time will answer. But it's clearly part of why the show's future looks less certain today than it has at almost any point in its history. Which brings us to the question everyone actually wants answered. Is American Pickers really over? So, is American Pickers actually over? Here's the honest, unglamorous answer. It depends on who you ask, and the people closest to it don't fully agree. On December 3, 2025, Danielle Colby posted an Instagram video marking her 50th birthday, in which she said plainly that she just found out American Pickers is done. She talked about standing at what she called an epic crossroads, shifting her focus toward running a museum project of her own, and having to figure out how to make money without the financial backing the show had provided for years. She admitted it would mean learning to do things completely DIY after more than a decade of steady income tied to the show, and asked fans to come along with her as she figured out what came next. That statement spread fast, for obvious reasons. It was about as direct as a cast member had ever been. Fans immediately started treating it as confirmation, sharing the clip everywhere, some genuinely mourning the end of something they'd watched for 16 years. But when Parade reached out to the History Channel for confirmation, a network representative pushed back, saying there was no truth to the claim that the show was finished, while acknowledging the more modest fact underneath it. They simply weren't producing new episodes at that particular moment. It's worth sitting with that gap for a second. A cast member saying one thing publicly and the network saying something noticeably softer, almost like two people describing the same relationship differently depending on how much they've already emotionally moved on. Then, in February 2026, Mike Wolfe addressed it directly in an interview with TV Insider. His answer was clear. American Pickers is not cancelled, it's on hiatus. New episodes of Season 27 resumed on February 15th, and a week later, his new solo series, History's Greatest Picks with Mike Wolfe, premiered on the same network.
Me and Mike are always out on the road, and we're always cooped up in the van. So when there comes a time that we can hop on a motorcycle and ride with a pro like Bino, it's fantastic.
In that interview, Mike talked about how long he'd worked to get that new project off the ground. He mentioned struggling for roughly 5 years to make it happen, and how proud he felt to still be producing content for History Channel after all these years. So here's where things actually stand, as plainly as the facts allow. American Pickers has not been cancelled. It is also not currently in active production the way it once was, and its most visible cast member now has a second show competing for his time and the network's attention. Those two things, not cancelled and not really running, can both be true at once. And in television, that gray area is usually where long-running shows quietly go to fade, rather than end with a bang. Networks rarely announce a cancellation outright when a show still has any residual audience goodwill left. It's simply easier and cheaper to let it drift into an indefinite hiatus and see what happens. Worth noting too, History's Greatest Picks isn't a reboot of American Pickers, and it isn't trying to replace Frank or recreate the Van and Backroads format that made the original work. It's Mike telling stories behind historical artifacts and relics on his own.
Ladies and gentlemen, my next guest is a writer with the #1 best-selling book in the country, or as the White House calls it, a garbage book. A garbage author. Please welcome Michael Wolfe.
Under a new title, with a different format built around him as a solo host, rather than a duo bouncing off each other. Reasonable people can read that either as Mike finally getting the project he says he spent 5 years trying to make happen, a passion project that had nothing to do with American Pickers slowing down, or as a sign of exactly where his energy is going, now that American Pickers isn't the only thing on his plate. Probably, honestly, it's a bit of both. and the two explanations aren't even mutually exclusive. What's undeniable is how much has changed since 2010. The show that once ran on the strength of an effortless, real friendship is now navigating a world where one of its founders has passed away. The other survived a crash that nearly took his life, and its most reliable cast member has publicly, if informally, said her goodbyes. Whatever comes next for American Pickers, it won't be built on the same foundation it started with. Maybe the more honest question isn't whether American Pickers gets renewed for another season. It's whether the version of the show that made people fall in love with it in the first place, two old friends, a van, and the open road, was ever really something a network renewal could bring back in the first place. So that's the real story. Not a betrayal, not a conspiracy, just two childhood friends who built something real, watched it tested by addiction and years of unspoken hurt, and found their way back before it was too late. Frank's gone. Mike nearly wasn't far behind him. And the show they built now sits in limbo. Not cancelled, not really running. Its own cast split on whether it's still alive. Maybe that's the most honest ending this story gets. So tell me, do you think American Pickers ever comes back? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want more deep dives like this, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.